Hi everybody, this is Neil from TheOverclocker Magazine. So let's get right into it. Today I'm bringing you the ROG STRIX GeForce RTX 3080. Number one, this card is actually extreme overclocking ready. This card actually has about 22 power stages or phases, and more so, it also has locations where you can solder, I think, the EVC2, and you can also measure various voltages you'd be interested in when you're doing that sort of extreme overclocking. So what do you really want to know about it? You want to know how it goes, right? Before I tell you how it goes, let me tell you how much power this GPU uses. So according to the specification, ROG recommends that you have an 850 watt PSU to use this GPU. And it's not excessive, actually. 850 watts is pretty conservative given that this card is capable of drawing up to 450 watts. Okay, or at least a little shy of 450 watts, because the highest figure I recorded was 440 watts, 447 watts actually. But that was because I had turned up the slider all the way to the maximum. Oh, actually talking about that, the weakest part out of the entire ROG experience is always the software, particularly when it comes to GPUs. GPU tweak needs an overhaul. If you look at something like the EVGA Precision, you look at Afterburner, and pretty much those two, they definitely look better than what GPU tweak is providing. And this is not a functionality thing, it's just a visual presentation thing. So let's go back to the power. This card draws a hideous amount of power, and even if you just take it out the box and leave it just the way it is, you don't do anything with it, you don't mess around with overclocking or anything of the sort, you are going to be pulling 370 watts. And talking about considerations you might have to make, you might also have to get a different case depending on how big your current case is as well. You may not be able to see it here, but this is a massive GPU. Look at this. Look at this. There are children that don't weigh as much as this thing, okay? So it weighs a lot, it's huge, but then again, with the weight comes some of the most impressive thermal performance I've ever come across. In my testing, including when I'm using Furmark, when I used Furmark, the highest temperature I ever saw was 72 degrees, okay? Under Furmark, it was 65 degrees. So you're getting a GPU that uses more power than we've ever had before for this class of GPU, but at the same time, ROG has managed to make a cooler that's even better than any other one they've made before. So you're getting a combination of these two things, and what that essentially means to you is that in your gaming, you're likely looking at 64 degrees, maybe 67 degrees under load. However, I must say that I'm using an open bench, okay, to record these temperatures. So your temperatures in your case may not necessarily be the same, but nonetheless, I definitely had very low temperatures, and with that, there was no noise. There was no noise that I could actually complain about. Given that I am using an open test bench, yeah, this is the coolest running GPU, high-end GPU I've ever come across. So it does a lot of firsts for me. Not only is it the most powerful GPU I've ever used, it's the coolest running one I've ever used, and it is the biggest one and heaviest one I've ever come across. So there are a lot of firsts for me. I'll tell you right out the box, this is a 4K GPU. Yes, you need to use DLSS in the titles that do support DLSS. Even in the titles that don't support DLSS, there's enough computing horsepower and rendering horsepower here to drive many of your games at a higher frame rate than the 2080 Ti could ever dream of. Okay, so we are talking at least, I think the lowest frame rate I recorded in all my testing was 50 frames per second. This is the average frame rates, okay? It was 50 frames per second, and that was in the remastered Crisis game that came out. Just to give you some context, we are looking at 29 frames per second for the 2080 Super. That sort of performance difference literally means that games are playable at 4K in the truest sense of the word. And the ones that do support DLSS 2.0, wow, then it's gaming nirvana. So overall, in terms of performance, it's exactly what you've been seeing in the other reviews, and perhaps even what you've been experiencing. So you might want to know, what is the ROG difference? What is the Strix difference? What am I paying for? And I'll tell you, okay, given the conversations I've had with other people who have 3080s, who have different brand 3080s, because of how well this one is designed, and just perhaps of how much power it's allowed to draw, it actually performs better than many of those just out the box. Literally, you don't have to overclock or anything. Just use it as is out the box. You're probably going to get better performance than you would from other lesser RTX 3080s. Again, I only have an example of one, but from what I've seen, the scores that I have versus the scores that I've seen from other people, Yeah, I think this card is definitely one of the better performing ones. And if purely it comes down to just the cooling capacity, matching that with the component quality and the ability to draw copious amounts of power, all of those things put together make sure that you have one of the highest performing GPUs that money can buy. At least in the 3080s, out of the air-cooled ones, this is probably, it set the bar for me, let's just say that. Okay. So in the testing, I actually went with full HD, and then I went with ultra wide QHD, and of course 4K. Reason I went with ultra wide because that's just my favorite resolution. And the reason I speak about that aspect ratio is because in as much as this card is really good at 4K gaming, this card is even better when playing ultra wide QHD. At 3440, 1440p, there are very few GPUs that, in fact, there aren't any GPUs that will give you this sort of performance. I mean, we are talking solidly over 70 frames per second in most games. In other games, yes, there's 60 FPS, but understand this. When I set the quality settings for benchmarks for testing all these games, I use their highest possible graphics fidelity. By highest, I mean I max out all the sliders. In Red Dead Redemption, I went higher than what the favored quality slider can go at its maximum. Okay, so I turned up everything. So the results you're seeing here, I would say perhaps lower than you would otherwise expect on your end if you just set presets. But again, that's why you spend this kind of money on a GPU, so you can get the best visual fidelity possible. That's going to be the difference between playing on the ROG Strix and playing on another lesser VGA. I'm not talking 3080, another, lower one, last generation, or playing on a console. You want to be able to max out all the graphics details and things like that. So specifically to the ROG Strix model, yeah, the power draw. The power draw is one thing that I keep going back to that just seems to allow this card to perform just so well. Whereas other VGAs are limited to 320 watts, some 350 and so forth. This one can pull power all the way up to 447 watts if you allow it to. Out the box, it's sub 400, but yeah, it really does pull that kind of power. In this class of GPUs, as I said, I haven't come across anything that delivers this sort of performance, draws so much power, but is able to cool all of that. That combination is perhaps the Strix difference that people are looking for. And of course, you're going to pay that ROG tax on it. Okay, so don't be surprised if this is the most expensive RTX 3080 money can buy outside of the water-cooled ones. But that said, it's got two modes. It's got the quiet mode, BIOS switch, okay, and it's got the performance mode. There really isn't any difference between these two. I mean, in performance mode, it is a little bit louder, so I would just leave it in the quiet mode. Since I'm now talking to you about overclocking as well, other samples are gonna go much higher, but this one could only master 30 megahertz or maybe 45 megahertz, right, when you're just doing some suicide runs. So I would just leave it as is. The overclocking that is worthwhile is actually the memory overclocking. So it isn't super amazing, anything that is out of the norm, but I did manage to get 21 gigabits per second, up from the default 19 gigabits per second. Okay, so that's pretty sizable, and believe it or not, it actually does make a difference in how well the card performs, particularly at 4K. You'll see a slight performance gain everywhere, right across, at least between 2 or 3 or maybe even 5 frames per second. I don't think it's worth doing that, okay, but if you're not playing 4K, if you are playing 4K and you must absolutely have that super frame rate or as high a frame rate as humanly possible, then yeah, go ahead and do the memory overclocking, but leave the core alone. You're generally not going to find much there. In fact, if you're going to tweak the core, I would rather just set a higher fan speed, perhaps keep the temperatures even lower so the boost clock is more consistently higher. Because think about it, this ROG Strix RTX 3080 is actually running cooler than the previous RTX 2080 Ti Strix. So that says a lot just to the build quality and just how much work has actually gone into putting together this hefty card. It is a behemoth of a card, but so is the performance. The performance is just monstrous. So yeah, despite this being my first RTX 3080 I've used, it is by far the most powerful graphics card I've used, and going by the results that I've seen from other models, this is the one to beat. This one has set the bar in terms of performance, power draw, and just even presentation. Okay, I might be wrong about that, but Thus far, I'm standing by that opinion. Anyway, that's all I have to say on the ROG Strix GeForce RTX 3080. Let me know what you guys think about the card. Are you looking to buy it? Are you going to pre-order it? Do you already have it? Are you one of the lucky ones who already have it? Leave your comments below. Remember to share, like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.